Good morning. Tell you what, I was not expecting what's on the podium up here this morning. It's kind of taken me back just a bit. I just want you to see that so you know what was staring at me. Because I was looking down, I just went, well, I wasn't expecting that, so I wanted you to know why. We've had a few things that we're having to have some technical difficulties, or should I say, just based on improvement. If you looked at the wall behind you, we're working on sheetrocking that, and so that means the screen is over here, and so I'm going to possibly look back just a little bit to make sure that the slide advanced and things like that. And so I want to also just tie in the concept that we just heard, having two different passages. They apply to what we talked about last week. We talked about the idea of the fear of the world or the fear of the Lord. And if we have the fear of the Lord this morning, we're going to have either the mentality of Isaiah or the mentality of Joseph in our walk as we are striving to reach out to other people this year. And so when we just saw in Isaiah chapter 6, when God asks, "Who will I send? Who will go for us?" Isaiah said, "Here am I, send me." So before he ever went, he says to God, "Send me." But you see, Joseph, he's coming from a perspective having been sent. He comes from a perspective of the hindsight that is 2020. Saying to his brothers I'm going to read this again. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I'm your brother Joseph." Well, context is, they're not going to recognize him because he's been in Egypt for decades at this point. And no longer do they recognize their 17-year-old brother that they sold into slavery. He said, "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." So in hindsight, he saw that God sent him. Isaiah said, "Send me." Either way, we're going to have the mentality to say to God, "Send me," or to say to God, "You have sent me." And so for the remainder of our lesson, we're also going to do something a little bit different. I've got 4 different points that we're going to be looking at for this lesson. But for this morning, we're going to focus on the first 3. And for tonight, we're going to focus on the 4th. And so we realize when we look at Joseph and how he says to his brothers, "God sent me," then we are able to go back and look at how God sent Joseph. And so we can look at the 3 different elements of individuals that actually sent him, that God was using for his purpose, for a greater good, a greater purpose that God had in mind that we just read in Genesis chapter 45 that we'll focus on more tonight. We realize in the first place his father sent him. The second place, a stranger sent him. In the third place, his brother sent him. But ultimately, it was his Father in heaven who sent him. And so that gives us our focus for this morning and for tonight. And so really today, there's going to be one major concept. Here am I, send me. And so in the first place, his father sent him. If you will, look at Genesis chapter 37. In fact, we're going to be looking at verses 12 through 28 as our main focus. And a few of those verses we won't be looking at, but I'd like for us to begin in chapter 37 and verse 12. "Now his brothers went to pasture their flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, 'Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them.'" So this is his earthly father saying, "I'm going to send you." And look at how he responds. It's very similar to how Isaiah responds to his heavenly Father. I love this. "And he said to him, 'Here I am.'" So he's saying, "Come, I will send you." And he says, "Here I am." You see, Joseph could not have gone to check on his brothers, to see his brothers, if his father hadn't sent him, but his father couldn't send him if he was a worthless son. If he was one that wasn't willing to obey what his father had said, if he was saying, well, but Dad, I'm doing something else, Dad. Don't you see that I'm in the middle of something here? No, he says, here I am. He dropped everything. And he followed what his father, his earthly father, told him to do. And look at verse 14. So he said to him, go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. If it wasn't for Joseph's willingness to obey his earthly parents, God could not have used Joseph to fulfill his ultimate purpose. And so if you think about it, that's why God has given us earthly parents. Some of us, we're still within the home. We're still working on growing within within that family unit. Whether you're the child in the home listening to and obeying your parents, or whether they're your parents trying to rear children, or whether you're out of the house and your grandchildren or your grandparents. When we think about this, though, all of us have parents at one time. And we all rely on this unit that God has provided, the family, in order for us to reach out to others. And in fact, that's what Paul was telling the Ephesian brethren. He was trying to explain that in chapter 4, 5, and 6, talking about the earthly family, or the Christian family, then the earthly family, and how those two go hand in hand. If we will turn to Ephesians chapter 6, we realize that there is a command that Paul brings out, and he's bringing out the command that was in the Ten Commandments. It says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Verse 1. Honor your father and mother. And if we just stop there for a second, when we hear the commands of God, we realize God's told us to do it, therefore He said it, I'm going to do it, because He meant it. And at the end of the day, we don't have to have the mentality of, well, what's in it for me? We don't have to have the mentality of, well, I want to know how this applies to me. Do I really have to do this? So often we can challenge what God has said in that way. How does this apply to me? We don't have to have anything to apply to us. God said it, we follow it. But what's the blessing here is there is an added promise. Notice it says, honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise. So there's actually a blessing that comes with following this command. If we will follow what God says, it will bless us in the here and now, but also in the hereafter. We realize that. But this is a blessing we know that is promised, it will bless us now. Verse 3 says, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. That it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. So think about it. What this command is saying is, if you obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right, then you're going to literally know how to obey the Lord. You're gaining incredible insight as to how to follow the commands of our Father in heaven by following your parents, by following your guardians who are striving to raise you in the Lord. But realizing also, when you honor your father and mother, when you take care of those who have taken care of you, sometimes that role is going to change and you take care of them. And so recognizing if this takes place, there's a promise that comes with it. It may go well with you. You see, you're also going to learn how, we all learn how to interact with other men and women within the world. How we interact with our bosses, how we interact just in the day-to-day life, being able to relate to other people, react, or to be able to obey. In fact, I'd like to look at Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 17. We realize that within the church, within the spiritual family, there are leaders that we have. And the Hebrews writer says, obey your leaders. Hebrews 13, verse 17. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. You see, if you obey your parents, it's going to bring a whole lot more joy for our elders, because you've already learned what it means to submit to authority. And so the idea is realizing, too, they have to give an answer for your soul and for my soul. In the same way, parents have a responsibility to raise their children. Verse 4 of Ephesians 6 says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." I believe verse 4 means that verse 1 can be possible. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. But there's a mutual respect that takes place here, so that we can interact with all people and that we can grow. We can be blessed, and we can bless others, especially strangers that we meet. We're going to come across individuals that we do not know, and we're going to know how to react because of how we've been brought up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And that brings us to the second point. Joseph was sent by strangers. A stranger sent Joseph. And because he was respectful of his father, he was also respectful of this stranger. So I'd like to look back at this passage in Genesis chapter 37 and verse 15. Do you ever notice this part of the passage? In one, we see, well, his father sent him and then his brothers sold him. But look at this individual we meet. We don't even know his name. So that's why I call him a stranger. He's a stranger to you and I. He was a stranger to Joseph. Verse 15 says, "And a man found him wandering in the fields of Shechem." Remember, he went to Shechem to find his brothers, but he can't find them, so he's wandering. And again, they don't have an ability to have a phone to reach out. They have no other way other than individuals around them. So notice this. He found him wandering, and the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" Say, "You look lost. I can tell something's wrong. What are you seeking?" He says, "I'm seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." The man said, "They've gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. If it wasn't for this stranger, God's providence would not have been fulfilled at that time. So you think about it, God was using this stranger to help fulfill His purpose. And so God can use strangers in our lives as well to fulfill His purpose as we strive to fulfill the Great Commission, to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. You know, every creature is going to be a stranger at one time. You think about it, every one of us in here at one time was a stranger. You know, even our children at one time, we didn't know. It's amazing. My son Gabriel and James, we the two differences in our pregnancies was we chose not to find out about Gabriel until he was born. We told them, don't tell us, we don't want to know. And that was part of the culture of being in Scotland. It was something that everyone said, "Oh, you can't find out," you know, and they were really particular about it. And we said, "Okay, we'll just go with that." We kind of enjoyed, though, falling in love with our child, not knowing whether he or she was our child, just knowing we fell in love with this precious gift from God. It was inspiring. Then when James came along, we wanted to find out because it really helped with the budget. But anyway, that was a whole nother discussion. But realizing, though, even with our own children, you don't know. They're strangers to you until that moment you see them. And so realizing that we're all strangers at one time, but then we grow close to one another and we realize there's a relationship that bonds and forms, and that's the concept of fellowship. That's the concept of the spiritual family. God doesn't want anybody to be strangers. He wants us all to be connected. That's why He's given us the church. And in fact, I think it's important when we look at Hebrews chapter 13 again. We were looking at verse 17, but I'd like to look at verses 1 through 2. It says, "Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. The word angelos means messengers. If anything, we've entertained a messenger from God. A stranger is an opportunity for us to reach them for the gospel. And that's why we show hospitality. But we let brotherly love continue because we want strangers to become brothers. Do we not? And I wanted to mention just one example of this, and I realize this is a hindsight story, and it's a stranger, two strangers that I met that really had an impact on my life. And to this day, I only met them one time, and it was just let's say it was more strange than as far as this stranger interaction. It was May of 2010. I was working on finishing my thesis, trying to graduate in May, because June, the next month, we were leaving to go to Scotland. And so there was a lot on our plate, trying to raise support. We had one supporting congregation that might support us, and if they did, that meant we raised the support we needed to have in order to live over there. And so there was a lot at stake here. And I remember driving back from Henderson to Selmer, where we lived, and I saw these two individuals on bicycles riding up the road on the highway there. It's a divided highway, kind of dangerous. And I noticed them because I thought, well, I don't ever see bicyclists or cyclists on there. And in fact, I didn't notice the bicycles first. I noticed the trailer behind the second bicycle and about 6 or 7 Scotty dogs that look like dots on leashes at first. And then I get closer, I realize they're Highland Terriers, and they're being led behind this little bike train. It's very strange. And as I get closer, I see these Scotty dogs, and I realize there's a connection to them and the Scots, because both the man and woman that were on the bicycles were wearing kilts. This is the weirdest. They were wearing kilts, long kilts. And I thought, this is odd. And in fact, as I got closer, I recognized they both had antlers attached to the front handlebars of their bicycles. I said, I have got to stop. And so I did a U-turn, and I came back. And they stopped, and I got out of my little truck, and I came over, and I said, I just couldn't help but noticing you're wearing kilts. And the man looks at me, and he says, we are of the clan of the Messiah. That's what he said. And I said, I didn't know that he was Scottish. I didn't. And I thought this was extremely odd. And I've come to find out, he explains to me, they had set out from Maine, and they were riding their bikes all the way through, and they had just been in Selmer coming up to Henderson on bicycles. And I said, what are you doing? He said, we're going around, we're trying to tell people. He said, if you've made a promise to God, you keep it. I thought, and then he said, do you have any water? So the conversation kind of went away, and I said, well, that was just the most odd interaction. There were several members of church that had seen them in Selmer, and they were going around telling people, if you've made a promise to God, you keep it. I thought, wow, that's so strange. And so, in fact, we were sitting there, and I mentioned everything on the plate, and again, this is all hindsight, looking back and recognizing really what that man had to say was really helpful. And I realized, see, we had said, if we raise the support, we will go to Scotland. Well, that's what we had promised to God. And so I literally thought, what promise have I made to God? And that was one. And so literally about a week before we're heading out to go, that congregation that we had approached, they finally made the decision they're going to support us. That meant we had the money raised, we could go. But then also around that same time, we received one email that said the eldership that had invited us to come to Scotland had dissolved. And so the very people who had invited us to come were no longer in charge. And we said, what do we do? We had raised the support. We said, well, okay. We said, we're going to go. And it was one of the hardest experiences we've had as far as in ministry for the 3 years. There were challenges, but in hindsight, I am so thankful we made that decision. Because I've seen God's providence in so many things. The 8 individuals who obeyed the gospel while we were there. We wouldn't have our children. And when it comes to ministry, it helped us recognize we've got to follow what the Bible says more than ever before, not what man thinks. So again, we weren't just using this man's, whatever you've promised to God, you do it. We weren't using that as our reason for anything. But in hindsight, even that stranger helped us, even though it was extremely strange. We never know when we're interacting with someone what will take place. And you don't know that individual you meet, they might become your brother or sister in Christ through the interaction that you have. May we be willing to reach out to strangers, because we want all people to become brothers or sisters. But we've got to realize that brothers and sisters are not always going to treat us the way that brothers and sisters are supposed to treat us. And Joseph understood that because his brothers also sent him. If you will, look at verses 18 of Genesis 37. Genesis 37 and verse 18. It says, they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. And they said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. If you'll recall, his dreams were in verses 5 through 11. Now Joseph, verse 5, had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. Why did they hate him to begin with? Verse 4, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. So this dream caused them to hate him even more. Verse 6 says, he said to them, hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. His brothers said to him, are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. And we understand he has another dream. And we understand it was the sun and the moon and 11 stars that bowed down to him. And his father recognized, he says, is your mother and I and your brothers, are we going to bow down to you? And his brothers hated him even more. They were jealous of him. But his father kept those things in his heart. And so they're seeing, here comes this dreamer. Let's see what's going to become of his dreams. So it adds another reason why they want to get rid of him. We've got to realize this dream that's going on, this is of God. This is not of man. And we've got to realize that even his brothers, in their attempt to try to kill him, God was still at work. And he was at work through Reuben, who made the decision, let's not kill him. He was going to try to take him back to his father, but Levi made the decision, or Judah made the decision, said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother, verse 26, and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. So his brothers sent Joseph to Egypt. His brothers were used by God to fulfill his ultimate purpose, and we're going to focus on that tonight. But we've got to realize this was not part of Joseph's plan. Joseph wanted no part in this. He just said to his father, here I am. And his dad says, go. And so he did. We do not know what will happen when it comes to this life. When it comes to our walk as we're trying to reach out, we don't know what others are going to do. Look at verse 21 of Proverbs 19. It says, many are the plans in the mind of man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. When it comes to your plan or my plan to reach out, what we've seen here is that God uses everyday interactions, everyday relationships with our father and our mother, with everyday relationships with strangers that we meet, or with interactions with our own siblings. God uses for his glory. And so sometimes I believe that we're all about the extraordinary rather than the ordinary. Because we're all about, well, I'll go on a mission trip that is scheduled, and that's when I'll reach out. You know, I don't have time to go on a scheduled mission trip, so when I retire, that's when I will reach out. But what we've seen in Joseph's life is that God is using the ordinary, everyday person that we come in contact with to help us reach out. And we've just got to have the mentality of Joseph, who said, "Here I am." Just the mentality of Isaiah, who said, "Here am I, send me." We've got to realize that God is sending us to every person that we come in contact with. Are we seeing God's providence in our lives as we're striving to reach out? I pray that that helps us in our quest this year to reach out, that we break down the wall of the extraordinary and use the ordinary for God's extraordinary blessings. We realize that when it comes to our plans, though, it's God's plan that will stand. Peter understood this when Jesus was telling him that, verse 18, he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you," this is John 21, verse 18 through 19, "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, "Follow me." And I'm so thankful that after all of the issues that Peter faced, obviously he had denied Jesus 3 times, and here he affirms Jesus 3 times. And Jesus tells him to follow him, and Peter did. Peter was willing to stand up and on the day of Pentecost proclaim the gospel sermon that through the response to that message, God added to His church 3,000 souls. And they continued to grow every day. So we realize that what Jesus is telling Peter, He's telling you and I. At some point, we don't know what's going to happen in our journey as we're striving to reach out to other people. All we know is God's will be done. Whether it's in hindsight, we're looking back, or it's now, you're making a decision, Father, I'm going to follow you, come what may. Whatever happens, who knows what God will do in your life. But God's not going to be able to use a closed mouth. When we have an opportunity to reach someone, He's not going to be able to use a closed hand if we don't reach out. Because what we've seen is God has established through His Son, when Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." And what did Jesus do with that authority? He said, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." So we see that it's the authority that God gave His Son gave to the apostles, and the apostles gave to the disciples. Therefore, you and I have the authority of God. God decided to use your hands. God decided to use my hands. I don't know why, but He did. Is God using you for His glory? Maybe you're here this morning and you've not had the right focus, and you need to rededicate your life to Him. We have an invitation that's offered to help you in any way we can, in prayers, to help us not just to survive, but to thrive and to try to bring as many souls to glory as we can. Maybe you're here this morning and you're not a child of God. Are you willing to confess that Jesus is Lord, repent of your sins, and be baptized in His name? Whatever your need is, won't you come? While together we stand and while we sing.